Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Firstly, let me clarify the title of this video as usual. It comes from the works of John Wheeler, one of the people who worked, well, on many different things, but among them was quantum mechanics, also gravitation, by the way. But in quantum mechanics, what it from bit means is his studies in quantum information. So the deal was that he concluded, or at least it was his hypothesis, that matter comes from information. So the information is like the most fundamental reality. Hence it, meaning matter, comes from bit, meaning information, right? So that's the idea. And by the way, I'll actually link everything I mentioned here in the description, meaning video specifically. So there is a video presentation of mine about quantum mechanics where I also touch on this subject. So I'll give it in the description as usual. And so according to that, again, many people today believe that, we live in a matrix and there is a computer code generating our reality, right? Something like that. Reality that we observe anyways. And I've examined these points from a little bit a different perspective than here, see below. But in my video, Is Our Universe a Computer Simulation? Again, link in the description, where I've concluded that the short answer is no. However, and here comes this video, there is a real code, I claim firmly, real code that we know, which is actually really creating reality, again, a tautology. And this code is the genetic code. So let me clarify. You may remember from the end of one of my very few first videos, Pseudoscience and Scientific Pyramids. At the very end, I give a general point about the genetic code, how it has a key contradiction, right? And then I repeat the same point and show how this very same contradiction actually brings forth the existence of gender in my video Understanding Gender, etc., etc. So you saw me talk about this quite a bit actually, right? So again, let's clarify a little bit more. What do I mean? How is genetic code creating reality that we know? Well, all that we know is actually created by it because, and let me give you a metaphor. I actually can't really explain it in any other way, or at least briefly. So the metaphor is what I would call like lock and key metaphor, or like a hand and glove metaphor. So the idea is that the genetic code is the lock, or is a glove. Well, lock is probably better. So genetic code is the lock, and everything that you can possibly perceive is the key, because only this particular key can fit this particular lock, right? This is the idea. And this particular lock is the genetic code. It is set in stone in some ways, in some, well, vague, type of way. So all of our interpretations and perceptions, etc., etc., therefore everything we observe is predetermined by genetic code. It is literally written in the genetic code, right? Whatever you can perceive and observe and etc., and think, I would also claim. So yeah, so that's basically the main point of this video. However, I want to also touch on the subject of life itself once again, but again from this perspective, that the universe is written in genetic code. So what are the implications for life as a natural phenomenon come from this? So what comes from this, and it's more of like a poetic, metaphorical, cultural take that I'm going to be talking about now, so that in particular that life is horrible and tyrannical, since very existence of life actually denies the existence of the soul, of individuality, of spirituality, if you wish, of personality even, right? Of individual, yeah, I already mentioned that, okay. So an individuum, according to this view of life, is basically only a link in the chain, right? I also have encountered another interesting opinion on this by Nietzsche, who could have thought, who said that actually like an individual is not a link in the chain, but rather a sum, like a funnel of everything that was before, right? It's the sum of all the ancestors in one piece, so to speak. So that's also an interesting view, but for what I'm going to be talking about, it's more like a link in the chain. That's a better metaphor, I would say, but Nietzsche's view certainly deserves attention, I would say. So you're just one of the manifestations of life, in some way, one of the masks it jokingly wears on one of the streets for a brief moment, only to quickly discard it and burn it and send its ashes to wander with the wind, So life will always go on. Again, speaking of life as a natural phenomenon, life will always go on, repeating in time and multiplying in space, even without you. Actually, especially without you, you could say even. And speaking about the repeating in time and multiplying in space, that's the definition of life that I gave in my Onion of Aliens 3-part video series. Again, see the links, especially I think in part 2, I focused on this quite a lot. So there you go. So this cruel, unholy, almost dead mechanics of life, speaking of oxymorons, these like blind gears of life, like just turning mindlessly, it's so soul crushing, right? And it manifests clearly in, for example, interpersonal relationships. Like roughly speaking, people don't care, right? That's what I mean. And it obviously includes specifically like one subset of these, which are like gender, intersexual type of relationships, right? Like I can bring you a lot of examples but I mean, if you've studied like intersexual relationships at least a little bit, at least from my video Understanding Gender, you would know what I mean. It's basically like these cruel mechanics of how men and women interact with each other, and not only men and women, but males and females in nature, right? In general, yeah, that's pretty rough. So yeah, one interesting offshoot of this is culture. So obviously culture is a little bit different from life itself, right? Something else. So culture, the exocortex, and in case you don't know what it means, it's basically like cortex is basically brain, right? Where we can put things in, like imagine things. But exocortex is like an external imitation of this space, mental space, if you wish. For example, we can imagine a triangle, but we can also take a piece of paper and a pencil and draw a triangle. So this would be like a model of what we can have in our brain, right? So that's what exocortex means, right? So this externalization of perceptions, something like that. So the culture, the exocortex, which is culture essentially needs to survive, to exist, is a bold attempt at writing our own code beyond life, right? This famous saying, apparently produced by Hippocrates, the first doctor, ars longa vita brevis. It's a Latin translation, of course, which means life is short, but art is like durable. Art is literally, life is short and art is long, right? So art sort of prolongs you, right? Even though your life is very short. So retaining our personality in bleak shadows of our works through art, something like that, to almost like earn the right to transgress mortality, And there is a curious cultural pattern connected to this, where the most valuable things in culture are actually considered those that lie beyond life, right? That actually even, yeah, exactly that, like transgress mortality, exactly because to achieve immortality means like an absolute triumph of individual will. So if you wish, art is like an absolute manifestation, according to culture itself, of the individual will, right? Something like that. Because it allows to transgress mortality again. I mean, it's kind of a trivial point, really, but I needed to make it to make the full picture, to make the picture more exhaustive. Not exhausting, maybe a little bit exhausting, actually. Yeah. So now, since you have art, since you have culture, since you have these external manifestations of yourself beyond yourself, you are no longer bound to life, right? You are no longer a slave to it in some way. So, and here comes again, I think, important realization about the invention of heaven and afterlife in general, because again, they, roughly speaking, care, whereas life, roughly speaking, doesn't, you know. So they, i.e. heaven and afterlife, save you from life, actually. No pun intended with respect to Christianity. You know, like Jesus is our savior because he says that there is an afterlife, etc., etc. So even if life is so horrible, we're fine, you know. You are saved. Even though, I mean, I'm kind of twisting and turning here the narrative, but that's one way of interpreting Christianity, right? And speaking about Christianity, there is definitely a criticism of life from Christian perspective, the one that Nietzsche, for example, detested. So, which roughly goes like, you know, life is weak, therefore it is bad, right? Let's actually cherish some other things, like again, heaven and afterlife, which are supposedly eternal or something to that effect, and supposedly like omnipotent, very, very strong, you know, ever present, etc., etc. So, yeah, so that's a criticism of life from Christian perspective. But I think it is possible to criticize life from anti-Christian perspective, which is kind of what I'm doing in this video, like for the most part. Except for the very first one where I talked about the genetic code. So what is the criticism of life from anti-Christian perspective? Well, it's the opposite statement, or rather opposite reasoning. It's like, life is strong, therefore it is bad, you know? So life is all dominating, like it's the most cruel and ruthless phenomenon in the universe, even, one might say. Life will crush you. Life is what gives you birth, you know, sort of encoding you, returning to the very, very first point, and initializing your program just to almost immediately erase it, right? And kill you, therefore. And kill everything else with you, everything that was present in your universe, right? Created by your genetic code, right? So, it has absolute power over you, again, with your whole universe being written in the genetic code inside you, and there's no way out. Like you might say, well, there is a way out, and you know what I mean, probably, but it doesn't change the picture. It brings the same result, right? Just maybe a little bit faster. So, yeah. I mean, you might delete the code yourself, right? If you know what I mean. But the result would be the same. The code would still be erased just by you, not by life itself. So, yeah. So, to conclude, long story short, the true computer code that the universe is written in is the genetic code, and the true tragedy of life and cruelty thereof is that it will go on no matter what, and you won't, no matter what. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.